Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Moore. I'm the CEO of the Virginia Funders Network, and we're so glad that you've joined us this afternoon for the second session in our broadband learning series. We're going to be talking about philanthropy's role in expanding broadband connectivity and affordability this afternoon. We have a great lineup of speakers for you. I'm going to tell you just a bit about VFN before we turn it over to our speakers today. As everyone probably knows, Virginia Funders Network is a membership association composed of over 100 funders investing in the Commonwealth. Together, we're building a connected and collaborative philanthropic community that advances opportunities for all Virginians. Today's topic is a perfect example of that. We are working across 3 pillars this year. One is to build a solid foundation for our brand new organization. I hope everyone has had a chance to check out the website. We've got an amazing board. We are building up our staff and also working out all of the internal infrastructure needs that our organization will require to be strong for years to come. The second pillar is around building a vibrant network. We have over 100 funders who have already invested in and joined the network. And we are so excited to have launched 5 networking groups and hosted over 20 learning opportunities for our members this year. And the third bucket is around leveraging the power of the network. Now that we have 100 funders that are investing in the state underneath one umbrella, what can we accomplish together? Today's topic is a perfect example of that as we think about the American Rescue Plan, $7 billion investment in Virginia, and the major investment that we are making as a state in broadband access and connectivity. This is an area of opportunity for philanthropy, and we're looking forward to learning more about this. I'd like to turn it over to Clark Casteel, the Danville Regional Foundation. Clark is also one of VFN's board members, and we're so glad to have him moderating today's call.
Awesome. Thanks, Katie. So really, as the title would suggest, and I'll just reemphasize what Katie said, our big question today is asking how philanthropy can be useful in our state's effort to really expand broadband connectivity and affordability. Today, we're going to hear from foundations across the state and also the country about their efforts to do this very thing. Our real hope and goal for this session is that philanthropic leaders throughout our state will see the possible in some of these examples and then figure out how to apply these lessons into your areas. We're going to start with an overview to put this conversation in some context. And we're honored and really lucky to have with us today to do this, Christopher Ali. Dr. Ali is the Associate Professor in Media Studies at the University of Virginia, having joined UVA in 2013 after completing his PhD at the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. Christopher's current research focuses on broadband policy and deployment in the US, and his new book is really on this subject entitled Fresh Broadband, the Politics of Rural Connectivity. With that, Christopher, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great, thank you so much, Clark, and thank you so much to everyone for having me speak today. I apologize that I'm not going to be able to stay for the entire meeting, but I am actually supposed to be teaching a class right now, but my students have graciously allowed me to start class 15 minutes late. I'm going to just go ahead and share my screen because I prepared a couple of slides for y'all today. I want to talk about 2 things, as Clark said, to hopefully set the stage for the conversation that y'all are going to have. The first is I want to talk a little bit about my book, the cover is here, and what's going on with broadband policy at the federal level. And next, I'll talk a little bit about what's going on here in Virginia with broadband and broadband funding. Alrighty, so my book, Fresh Broadband, The Politics of Rural Connectivity, is an analysis of federal and state policies regarding the subsidization, deployment, and regulation of broadband, specifically to rural communities. And we're hearing a lot about what is the digital divide or the multiple digital divides that are kind of plaguing the United States. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated this very painfully. Those who are and underconnected were not able to communicate, to work from home, to study from home. And this is why all of you are here, because you recognize this as a massive problem. The book, after completing this large amount of policy analysis, I say is both a story of failure and a story of promise. It's a story of failure because it is largely we have the digital divide, at least in rural America, because of a failure of federal policy. The market does not work in rural America. There is just not enough people. There's not enough return on investment. And so we have a policy apparatus that is designed to incentivize private providers to fill these gaps with what should be hopefully high speed, high quality broadband. But of course, we know that hasn't happened. Upwards of 42 million Americans currently lack access to the internet through a high speed broadband connection. But the book is also a story of promise, because one thing it does is it catalogs and does case studies on communities coming together to solve the digital divides for themselves. And it offers a roadmap that communities and states can take in order to work towards a more connected future. Ultimately, I argue in the book that rural broadband policy is both incomplete and broken. It is incomplete and broken because it lacks coordinated federal leadership. You might have heard a lot of acronyms being passed around: the FCC, the NTIA, the USDA. Who's in control here is actually quite unclear. It is broken and is incomplete because it's mired in a battle between these regulators. There's a bewildering amount of rules. If any of you have ever tried or ever have colleagues who have tried to get a grant or a loan from the federal government for broadband, there is inconsistent state intervention. Here in Virginia, we're just at the tip of really starting to intervene in this space with a lot of money. And we see a dominance of large providers and a policy process that tends to favor these companies over the hundreds of local internet service providers that connect the country. So to be sure, I mean, we're spending, before the pandemic, roughly $6 billion a year, and by we, I mean the federal government, for rural broadband deployment. So for infrastructure, for wires in the ground, for wires in the air, on telephone poles. But I argue that the money is not actually being spent efficiently or democratically. Otherwise, we would have corrected the digital divide much earlier than it is today. So a bit of a spoiler alert here for for those of you who don't want my book, which is fine. You don't have to buy it. But there are 6 major takeaways that I found. The first is that there is a strong historical connection between rural electrification in the 1930s and 1940s, rural telephony in the 1950s, and rural broadband today. And largely that's because of a massive and coherent federal investment in infrastructure. Something that before the infrastructure project or the infrastructure plan that's being debated in the House right now, we haven't actually seen that kind of massive push at the federal level like we did with what was called the Rural Electrification Administration, which was started in 1935. There's also what I call the politics of good enough. And here I say that federal policy has failed to bring affordable, high performance broadband to rural America. Instead, it has provided kind of like good enough broadband, right? So high cost is good enough for rural America. Slow speeds is good enough for rural America. Satellite internet is good enough for rural America rather than the next generation, rather than looking to future-proofing our broadband networks. Instead, our whole policy apparatus has just been about getting good enough broadband to rural communities. We're seeing a tremendous amount of what's called regulatory capture, particularly at the Federal Communications Commission. And this is where we actually have a policy apparatus that tends to privilege the largest and loudest providers, again, over the small and much more dynamic and much more local providers, which means they account for local accountability. I argue in my book that local broadband is the best broadband. And here that local communities have connected themselves in the absence of the private market or policy help. And this is often done through vital public-private partnerships, such as with a telephone or electric cooperative or a local internet service provider. And here in Virginia, we know that there's a tremendous push from electric cooperatives to offer either middle mile or retail last mile broadband. And kind of the hallmark example here would be the Central Virginia Electric Cooperative's Firefly fiber broadband company. I spend a little bit of time in the book talking about fiber farm, which is vital for contemporary agriculture, broadband to the farm, but it does come with some unacknowledged challenges. One of them, which is something that we don't often talk about when we kind of have this hype around fiber optic connections, is that fiber to the farm actually doesn't work because you need a wireless solution, because you can't possibly connect with a cable, a combine or a harvester or a tractor. Sounds pretty self-explanatory, but it kind of gets lost in the weeds about that we need a wireless solution for precision agriculture. And last but not least, I caution my readers to beware of the hype of the new and the next technologies that are just around the corner. So we often think about 5G, we think about low Earth orbital satellite, Starlink, right? Is this going to be the end all and be all of rural broadband? And I hate to tell you, but it's not. The way that we're going to connect this country is through a myriad of different technologies. It's going to be wireless, it's going to be fiber. Yes, it's going to be low Earth orbital satellite. It might even be in some areas 5G, but I think what worries me a lot, and for those of you who are working with different communities, you know, when someone says, when a board of supervisor tells me, hey, you know, we're just going to pause our broadband deployment plans because Starlink is just around the corner or 5G is just around the corner. And that's not going to happen. And so that's definitely a concern when the hype kind of usurps really good local broadband planning. So that's a little bit about Farm Fresh Broadband. I encourage you all to read it and certainly to reach out if you have any questions about my writing. I thought I would also take a kind of step back and talk about what's going on at the federal level, because there is a tremendous amount of money that is coming down the pipe right now, specifically for broadband deployment and affordability. So the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 created a $3.2 billion program called the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. That program is ongoing right now with the Federal Communications Commission. And what that's done is subsidize broadband subscriptions for qualifying low-income households. And that offers a subsidy of $30 a month particularly for households who have been impacted by COVID-19. Economically impacted. Now, that money does not go directly to the consumer. It goes to the provider, who is then able to offset a broadband subscription. What's really important to note here is that Americans pay almost, well, in some accounts might say the most for a broadband subscription. The average broadband subscription here in the United States is $84 a month, which is huge. It's double the amount that Europeans pay. So $30 a month doesn't actually create a massive dent, or as much of a dent as we'd like to see with how much we're paying for broadband. The Consolidated Act also offered $1 billion for travel connectivity, $300 million for rural broadband, and $285 million for broadband at historically Black colleges and universities. The CARES Act of 2021 specifically gave $100 million to USDA for their program. But what it also did, of course, is give states and counties just kind of a blank check, well, not a blank check, but a check for whatever they wanted. And a lot of counties here in Virginia, Nelson County in particular, has been able to use quite a lot of their CARES Act money towards broadband projects. I know I'm talking really fast here, but I'm trying to be sensitive to my students. The American Rescue Act, ARPA, colossal amount of money going towards states and broadband, almost $220 billion that will go to state support, and states are free to use that money how they will. Some will use it for broadband. Virginia, for instance, did. Governor Northam in the summer dedicated $700 million from Virginia's $4.3 billion ARPA state grant towards broadband. There's also $10 billion specifically set aside for state infrastructure, and a $7 billion program meant to connect schools and libraries with high-speed broadband. Then, of course, we've got the infrastructure package, which has passed the House, passed the Senate rather, has not yet passed the House. This is offering $65 billion for broadband, $42 billion of which will go towards deployment, another $14 billion towards affordability. It does fall short of the original promise of the Biden administration at $100 billion, but of course, $65 billion is nothing to scoff at. There are some concerns around this money right now. So it's going to be really interesting to see when the rules are written around who is eligible for this money, what's going to happen. Broadband is still defined at a rather low speed, so that's something to be wary of. We're seeing the money flow through the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA, rather than the Federal Communications Commission. There is a lack of protection for municipalities and cooperatives. And the concern here is that will the big players, will big telco and big cable just end up gobbling up a lot of this money and not leaving a whole lot to local providers. So this is definitely something that we're all going to have to be watching for, is when the rules are passed about this $65 billion. Now, here in Virginia, as I said, this summer, Governor Northam announced plans for $700 million from the ARPA allocation in Virginia, pledged for broadband deployment. There are no rules yet or regulations implemented about this money. So this can be really interesting to watch. And I would wager dollars to donuts, as they say, that the new administration will take action on this pretty quickly. There's $50 million that is allocated yearly from the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative. This is called the VATI program. Some of you may be familiar with it. Again, at $50 million a year. This is new. It actually in 2019 was $4 million a year. So Virginia's really stepped up their game when it comes to statewide funding. This is a permanent program. There's also $11 million yearly that is for a broadband program for the Tobacco Commission. There is a goal of functional universal service in this state by 2024. Governor Northam announced that, and he accelerated the plan. The plan was originally for universal service by 2028. So it's hoped that with this new $700 million that we'll see a massive investment in broadband deployment. None of this money, it's important to note, is offset for affordability issues, right? This is all for deployment. So affordability is something we have to be very, very conscious of. Are these providers who are getting this money going to offer, for instance, a low-cost plan for families who qualify? That's definitely something to think about as you're working with your colleagues. Broadband is still defined, oddly enough, at what's called 10 megabits per second download, 1 megabit per second upload in the Commonwealth. That is a very slow definition of who is served, like incredibly slow. We haven't had this definition at the federal level since 2015. Definitely something else to be weary of is we want to make sure that that folks who get part of this money are deploying future-proof network, that are deploying future-looking networks rather than just relying on this definition, which is not good enough. Even the current definition at the Federal Communications Commission of 25 bits per second down, 3 megabits per second up is not good enough, for instance, for a family of 4 to do online education and work from home. And, just the kind of quality of life stuff that we all, kind of enjoy, like, binging Netflix on a Saturday. It's not good enough at these speeds. So this is something that we really need to be thinking about at the Commonwealth-wide, the statewide level, is why our definition of broadband is so slow. So a couple of quick takeaways here. We need to remind lawmakers and policymakers that local broadband is the best broadband. We need to make sure that history does not repeat itself when it comes to the infrastructure package. And ultimately and fundamentally, we need to remember that broadband is not about technology, companies, or policies. It's about people, right? And this is why I love concluding these talks with this amazing quote from Bernadette Jocelyn in an interview with me for the book, who says that everything is better with better broadband. And I just love this idea because it really puts people first, right? This idea that our lives will be materially improved with a faster, affordable broadband connection. So with that, I want to thank you all so very much for taking the time to invite me and for listening to me for these 20 minutes. I do have to run, but please feel free to reach out on email, on Twitter. This is my hound dog Tuna, who was an amazing research assistant during my research for this book. We drove 4,000 miles across the country talking about broadband to anyone who would talk to us. So thank you very much again, and have a wonderful conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Christopher. We really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
So this is VFN's second broadband session, and the first was really well summarized by Christopher, although he probably did it inadvertently. The two big lessons from our original session on this were that the two big issues are affordability and access. Those are the big issues around broadband coverage. And so now this is really part of our goal today is to determine how philanthropy, again, can be useful at filling these two big issues. So now what we're going to do is we've got a great panel together who's going to talk about how their foundations are working on these two really dual issues in their places. What I thought I do first is let me go through and introduce all the panelists, so you'll recognize who these faces are on here. And then I'll go back to them each and they'll talk about how they're working on this issue in their region. So first, let me introduce Reverend Cory Anderson. Cory is the Chief Innovation Officer for the Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation in Arkansas. Winthrop Rockefeller is a tremendously innovative and effective foundation focused on building a thriving and prosperous Arkansas that benefits everyone in Arkansas. Cory is a relentless collaborator. He builds and maintains local and national partnerships, launches bold initiatives, and strategizes to ensure the foundation pursues equity for all Arkansans. Then we have DeWitt House, and DeWitt is a senior program officer with the Harvest Foundation in Martinsville. Harvest is a place-based hospital conversion foundation doing some really exciting work focused on the transformation of their region. DeWitt's background is in education, where he served for over 30 years as a teacher, a coach, an athletic director, and a principal, and most recently as assistant superintendent in Henry County Public Schools. Next, we have Jerry Kuthy, and Jerry serves as a program officer for the Cameron Foundation in Petersburg. Cameron works to transform the Tri-Cities and surrounding counties into a healthy, vibrant, and economically vital region. Jerry manages numerous grants and special projects throughout the Tri-Cities areas of Virginia. And finally, we have Meghan Pietrantonio, who's the Vice President and Director of Strategic Initiatives for the Truist Foundation. Established in December 2019, the foundation's purpose is to inspire and build better lives in communities. Meghan is leading the design, development, and implementation of the new foundation's national grant-making strategy and signature programs. Prior to this role, she served as First Vice President and Relationship Manager within the foundations and endowment specialty practice at SunTrust Bank. So with that, I want to go back and I want to turn it over to our panel. And we're going to start with Cory. Cory, tell us how Winthrop Rockefeller, that's really doing some amazing work, as I suggested, is thinking about this broadband issue throughout Arkansas.
Sure, thank you, Clark, and it's a pleasure to be here. And kudos to Chris, the presenter that just left. I mean, he hit the nail on the head, and I'm really looking forward to grabbing his book and using it maybe as a blunt instrument up against some of the folks that we're trying to get to think just more comprehensively about broadband, like some of the things that he talked about the definition of the speed of broadband, and it strikes me. So Winthrop Rockefeller Foundation, our mission is a relentless pursuit of economic equity, educational equity, social, ethnic, and racial equity for all Arkansans. And the way that we define equity is when equity as a goal means that when you start talking about outcomes and you begin pulling data out and looking at populations and people and places, that you can't tell anymore who's who, right? So the data washes out based on your race, ethnicity, where you live, rural, urban, all of those. So the data washes out. You won't be able to tell who's who. Equity as a framework for action means that if we want to get to equity as an outcome, that we have to invest more in the places, the people, the populations that have been marginalized for the longest, that have received the least, et cetera, right? I say all that to say that the person that defines high-speed broadband as 10-1 would never accept that in their own household. They would not live with 10-1 in their own household, right? So part of what we're trying to do is help the folks that are making the rules, that are deciding about where the money goes, is help them understand better. Again, Chris's last thing, that everything is going to be better with better broadband. Our economy is going to grow, education system is going to get better, healthcare is going to get easy. And so there are a couple of things that we've been doing over the last couple of years. One, and again, Chris picked up on some of this, we're trying to encourage and incentivize our state to better organize the information about broadband in general and about the resources that are meant to be applied to making broadband better for everybody. And the reason that that's important is because at some level, it doesn't matter how much the federal government says they're going to invest in broadband. When it comes down into states and then it gets down into counties, the resources, without intervention, the resources are going to land in the same places that all the other resources always land. And those places are not the communities that have been marginalized, neglected, set aside, et cetera. So we could have, $1 zillion in broadband infrastructure money, and that little bitty town that sits in the valley, that's off the highway, that's down the road, that's through the holler, they're still not going to have good broadband access because nobody is thinking about that town where the decisions are being made. So what we're trying to do is help our state folks, help our federal friends, just be more accountable and transparent about where the resources are, who can get access to them, how you get access to them, what you can do with them, and those sorts of things. Put it on a website, make it easy, make it accessible for folks. The second thing, and this is just as important, and this is a thing that Philanthropy can do, is we're creating sort of a philanthropic collaborative to invest in the technical assistance that those marginalized communities are going to need to access those resources. So again, you're a mayor in, name a little town in a little county off the beaten path, and somebody says to you, hey, there's all this money available. You may not have the ability to go fill out the forms, jump through the hoops, light the fires that you need to get that money. What we're thinking about and trying to create a mechanism is to invest in the technical assistance so that anybody, whether you're a town, a school superintendent, a hospital CEO, anybody that needs to get access has the support they need. Again, fill out the forms, go on the website, all those sorts of things. And then the third thing that we're doing and that Philanthropy can do is to create pilots and case statements for the reality of universal broadband access, right? And here's the thing, and Chris made this point. I really look forward to digging into his book. The only reason that, again, the little bitty town in the valley, over the mountain, off the road, the only reason that those folks got electricity and access to public water is because we built these public-private partnerships to make that a reality. That would not have happened if it were left up to the private providers, right? Because they're in the business of making money and they're in the business of making as much money as possible. And so you need these public-private partnerships to create the incentives either to make it a public thing or for the private folks, he mentioned big telco, big cable, or for them to get into these small spaces. So we're trying to create sort of case studies and models. So for example, in a neighborhood right here in Little Rock, I'm in the city, but right here in Little Rock in a neighborhood, low-income neighborhood, what we're trying to do is gather we've got a private provider that's working with us. And what we're trying to do is gather as many people as possible in that neighborhood who are eligible for the current emergency broadband benefits or are eligible for the $50 that you can currently get, right? And sort of our theory is, and I'm just making up numbers, but if you can get 200 families in that neighborhood that are eligible for that $50, they sign up with this specific provider that has agreed to do this. And with that, whatever 200 times $50 is a month, that provider will actually create a broadband network that anybody in that community can access. So if you got 200 people that sign up, you may have 500 families in the community. And those other 300 families are going to get access to broadband, and it's going to be wireless. And it's going to, and I love Chris's terms, it's going to be future-proof, right? So it's going to be wireless. It's going to be created in building the infrastructure in a way that you can upgrade it in the future without having to tear it down, dig a new hole, run a new line, without those things having to happen. But what we're doing with this is, again, is making the case that with government support, you can actually create these universal networks that still allow the private provider to make money, right? Now, maybe they're not gonna make as much money as they might make, but they can still make money. And so creating those case studies and pilots again, from a philanthropic perspective, are the things that we then carry to our state, to other private providers, to the federal government to say, hey, here's another opportunity, here's another path that might get us to the universal access. So encouraging and incentivize folks to organize and be transparent about the resources that are out there, investing in the technical assistance that the most marginalized communities are going to need to get equitable access to these resources, and then creating pilots and case statements for how we get to universal access. And I always start the conversation with universal access is the goal. Because I think if you start anywhere less than that, then again, the folks, the communities, the people that have been left out, they're the folks that are going to end up with 10-1 and not be able to do anything while the rest of us are binging Netflix.
Thanks, Cory. That was awesome and really a great start to our panel. We are going to leave some time on the back end for questions. So if you have questions for Cory, and I wrote down 3 or 4 here myself. So if you have questions, we're going to hopefully have some time at the end for Q&A with all of our panelists. So now I want to turn to my friend DeWitt House. DeWitt, talk to us a little bit about how Harvest, a place-based funder, is thinking about this issue and the work you all are doing.
Well, start with Clark. We're still trying to fill out what our actual role is, whether it's a funder, an investor, convener, policy advocate. We're trying to assess all of those things in terms of where we fit. We currently, as Cory mentioned, the public-private partnership, and we're right now serving as a convener because we have one of the VATI applications that's pending for about $33.5 million as a partnership with AEP, providing about 96 miles in our community of fiber. And we're also, it's a combination, it's a collaborative between Franklin County, Patrick County, and Henry County in terms of being able to get this up and running. We with that particular application would bring somewhere in the neighborhood of 3,000 to 4,000 people in the past online. And the other thing I think that you can't forget about what Dr. Ali talked about is not only access but affordability, keeping those things at the forefront. And one of the things that I like about the internet service provider that is our partner in this project is too often we've heard about the providers won't go down this street because it's too far and it's too expensive. And they've built into this that the first 2,000 feet is covered by the grant funds. They will run that. And then if it's 2,500 feet and you got the first 2,000 feet paid for, the remaining 500 feet is a split. It's $1 per foot or yard. It's $1 cost, which would be an additional $500, and half of that's paid by the internet service provider and the other by the individual. But there's also a mechanism to include individuals who are low to moderate income, which it would be taken care of at no cost. So that's one thing that's built in their application, and we felt like made our application a lot more attractive in doing that. But here we also have in the city of Martinsville, which is in the center of Henry County, they already have a fiber network called MyNet. And one of the challenges that we have going forward is figuring out how we build that network out to include more people and bring them on board, because the fiber is already there in the city of Martinsville. And it's just a matter of now how we build it out and take advantage of those opportunities. And again, as Cory mentioned earlier and Dr. Ali, the language that's involved in this, we've done one of the studies that DHCD helped to fund. The technical language in it is tremendous. So, being able to navigate that part is also going to be very critical for foundations, and if they want to do this work, to be able to understand what all that language is about, and also getting the policy advocates to address the 10-1 that Cory mentioned earlier. Again, it's not enough. So, you know, again, we're at a point, Clark, where we're playing part convener. We don't know what part we're going to be playing in terms of funder or an investor or policy advocate, but all of those things are on the table for us now as an organization.
No, that's absolutely great, DeWitt. And this notion that I think place-based funders who at the state will understand is your role changes as you get into this work, right? Nobody at Harvest Foundation or at Danville Regional Foundation is an expert on this subject. So what we can do initially is exactly what you've done. You convene folks, you get around the table, you try to figure this issue out, you do some planning, and then you adjust. You figure out where your foundation can play a role. So I think that's great.
You know, we followed the project in Grayson County that AEP did there, and then the opportunity came about for us to be a partner in the second AEP project here in Martinsville, Patrick, and Franklin. So again, being able to have those connections is always helpful.
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely right. Well, good. Again, keep your questions for DeWitt, and then we'll have some time at the end. Next, I want to move on to Jerry. Jerry, talk to us about what you're doing up in Petersburg in the Tri-Cities region. I know you're doing some innovative things, especially in a couple of your places.
Well, it's kind of you to call it innovative. I don't know if it's innovative, but we're trying to be aggressive. So we weren't doing anything with broadband 2 years ago, and it was something that we were aware of, but not something that we had grant programs around. And then when the pandemic started in April of 2020, we rolled out an emergency grant program to school systems that we serve where they could help them with technology infrastructure. And almost all of those grant requests come in. Well, all of them were either partially or fully for internet hotspots. And it wasn't just the rural areas, but it was cities where they had coverage, but they couldn't afford it. And so it became apparent to us very quickly just how big of a gap there was in terms of broadband service and coverage. And so we viewed the hotspots as a necessary triage type approach, where kids were at home learning virtually. They had to get on access to school that week, and they couldn't wait for us to build out infrastructure. But it started us with thinking about how to look at this more long term. And DeWitt just referenced it with what they're doing. But the Department of Housing and Community Development has the Virginia Telecommunications Initiative, or VATI grant program. And that hasn't been around very long. It's only been around a few years. Last year, they gave out about $40 million in grants. This year, they had $50 million budgeted, but with the American Rescue Plan funds that got surged in there, as was referenced, it's now at $750 million. And the way that grant program works is a locality or a region can apply for state funds, and these state funds will cover 80% of a broadband project, with the private internet provider needing to cover at least 10%, and then the locality needing to come up with another 10%. So this year we have this unique window, whereas there's this huge surge in funds that are available to get localities universal coverage. And that's what we're doing with two that we serve, Dinwiddie and Sussex counties, where there are big gaps there. And I have to say that we got to this point by a grant from the Truist Foundation. LISC National reached out to us, my colleague Brandy Kramer and I, back in the fall, because they had this grant from Truist to work with 4 localities throughout the United States on broadband strategies. And so we were fortunate to connect with them, and Cameron's been convening and playing that role to hold it together. But the Truist funds have brought in expertise from LISC National and broadband consultants, because to echo Clark's point, we definitely didn't have the expertise on our staff. We're learning very quickly, but we didn't have the expertise. And so right now, the immediate opportunity is those VATI funds. And so we're applying for about 23 million in state funds to build out broadband in Dinwiddie and Sussex. But to meet that local match requirement is a heavy lift for our localities in 1 year. And so that's where Cameron is coming in. Our board is committed up to 1.15 million to this project, which will get the localities to half of their match requirement. And we're doing that through the governor's Commonwealth Connect Fund that's going to be rolled out in Farmville tomorrow or Friday at a conference that the governor's hosting there. To try to help elevate the profile of these grants, because even though there's 750 million in grant funds available, there are close to $1 billion in requests. And so it's still a competitive process. And so we're trying to make sure that's one prong of our strategy, is to roll out and make sure that everybody has the possibility of broadband. And we're doing that through fiber connections in cooperation with the Prince George Electric Co-op here. But the other piece that everybody's talked about is the affordability piece. And that's going to be the harder piece. And in 2 weeks, we got a presentation from those Truist funded consultants to talk to us about a menu of strategies for affordability and accessibility. So I'm excited about that, but that's going to be a tougher slog because there aren't as many of the state and federal funds that are available for that in a clean way. And so we're starting to talk about that in terms of maybe working with local social service departments or agencies to help roll out that emergency broadband benefit program that is going to be $30 a month. That was $50 a month. How do we make that accessible and easy to people? But then the issue is also going to be devices. So if you can't afford an internet connection, good chance you can't afford a computer or a Chromebook in the home. So those are going to be the tougher issues that we're tackling in the coming year. Thank you. And thanks for having me today.
No, thank you, Jerry. So we're going to end and Jerry keyed this up for us. We're going to end with Meghan with the Truist Foundation. So Meghan, talk about how this new foundation is thinking about this issue, and would love to hear in particular why you think this is important and why you're working so hard on it, really across multiple states. So Meghan.
Thank you, Jerry, or thank you so much, Clark and Jerry, for calling us out on the project that we collaborated on. And yeah, I think that one of the questions that I might have if I was sitting in your seats as kind of collaborative to talk about grant opportunities for grant makers to come together across the state, I'd be wondering, okay, how does this fit in with our strategy? And that's a conversation that we had with the Truist Foundation over the past 20 months here with COVID. And really as COVID was kind of really roaring, we were also working with our board on a new strategic plan. And as we were doing our field research and interviews and really understanding how the Truist Foundation could support our communities in a unique way that was really needed at the community level, we really saw that two areas we could play a significant role in. And so we, with our board, finalized our strategic plan last November, and our two kind of pillar areas going forward. The first is strengthening small businesses, and the second is building career pathways. And so that was decided about a year ago. And then we were faced with okay, now how do we implement? And pretty quickly we realized that good, strong connectivity is kind of a foundational requirement for each of those two program areas to be successful. So while the Truist Foundation doesn't have a specific grant-making pillar to support broadband access, affordability, and kind of the additional infrastructure that's required, we know that 80% of jobs are posted online. So if we're trying to get people to enter into kind of a pipeline, a career pipeline, where they're going to have access to jobs that will help them grow and have more economic mobility, they're going to need to be able to access those jobs online. We know that, business banking, we know that any of the digital kind of marketplaces, those all require a really strong secure, stable broadband access for small business owners to be able to really compete with the Amazons and the Walmarts and the Targets and everybody else in the world. So we know that even though broadband is not a pillar of our strategy, it's a critical component for us to have success in each of our 2 grant-making pillars. So that, came up last spring, and we really started to talk about, okay, now how does this look? How can we support this at the national level or the super regional level? Because as you guys heard, our strategy is cutting across with a priority focus on the Southeast and the 18 states where Truist has a presence, but really looking at how do we invest in programs that help our country, kind of all 50 states. And broadband again came up as one of those issue areas that, generally speaking, while every place has its own unique challenges, barriers, and opportunities, there are some kind of key ingredients that we feel like we can target with our grants at the national level that then can go to intermediaries like Cameron, like Harvest, to then be able to deploy at the local level. And so I am super excited to be on this call because I do feel like we have all these different pieces that can work together to bring more access to and affordability to those that are in need. And I'll tell you more, I think, later about one of the projects that we are considering and hope that there will be some investments through that project in Virginia.
That's great. So, so one of the things that I just want to highlight from Meghan that I think we also heard touched on from Cory and others is there was this question. DRF has been involved in this region for 15 years, and we didn't do major broadband investments. It didn't quite fit into our strategy. But one of the things that the pandemic really highlighted was that no, it actually fits into all of your strategies. And to go back to Christopher's quote, it really does make everything better. Broadband makes everything better. So it's been interesting to see from my perspective, and I think the others have highlighted how the importance of this issue on all of our plates, right? It's all of a sudden become more important for all of us. And I do think that's why it's great that VFN is having this platform so we can all talk about what that looks like. So now we've got time for questions. So we would love to hear from others on here, questions you may have for really any of the panelists. And we've heard, Cory, I think, laid out their kind of 3 areas of focus, and the third of those was on pilots. So I'd love to hear from any of from maybe especially Cory and Meghan, a couple pilots that you're highlighting, a couple programs that you're highlighting that may be in particular of use for the rest of us.
I may just add one more, and this is a different kind of pilot, but again, I think it's an interesting use of philanthropic resources, right? So prior to COVID cares and the like, one of the ways, one of the funding threads for broadband expansion was what were called these reverse auctions, where and I'm going to say like 5 words about it because I'm going to mess it up. But private providers say that the federal government said, "Hey, we see that in this area of your locality, they need more broadband access, right?" And then private providers would say, "Okay, we can get broadband in that area for X number of dollars." And then somebody else would say, "Oh, no, we can do it for this number of dollars." And somebody else would say, "Okay, we can do it for this number of dollars." So it's basically what they call a reverse auction, where providers were awarded basically territories to expand broadband, to expand internet access. I keep use broadband, they're not necessarily the same thing, but to expand internet access. But the way that those worked was that the federal government said, okay, provider X, you've won this reverse auction for this territory. We're going to give you whatever, $10 million to do this deployment. Here's the catch. The $10 million is over 10 years, and it's a reimbursement. So you do a little work for a month, you send the federal government or whatever an invoice, hey, we did X number of dollars worth of work this month, and they send you money, rinse and repeat over the 10 years, technically, right? So we had providers said, like, come to us and say, hey, we're going to get this reverse auction. This is for the Delta of Arkansas. And if it takes us 10 years to do this, by year 3, we're going to be behind, right? Like by year 3, we're just going to be deploying stuff that's not going to be of any use to anybody. And what they said was, if we could get some capital up front, then we could do more, we could do faster, and we could build out, again, a business plan that's going to support lower cost. So what we did was we recruited Philanthropy to actually provide guarantees so that this company could actually access, it ended up being like $2 million in cash up front. So that they could go quicker, they could go further, they could go faster. It was a lower cost of deployment, so they could lower the cost to the ultimate customer. And basically, all it costs us so far, because they're just guarantees, is just our signature. And there were 4 of us. It was us, the King Foundation, the Wingate Foundation, Arkansas Community Foundation. We each said we'll guarantee $500,000 each, signed on the dotted line with our local bank, who knows all of us are good for it, right? The provider gets $2 million. They're going in, big, faster, more, lower cost, et cetera. So far it's working out. But again, that sounds like a lot, like it's $2 million, it's a guarantee, all the like. But honestly, that's a pilot. DeWitt mentioned like what are the other roles that we can play? So we're an investor in broadband deployment for the Delta. We did it because it's important enough for us to make that investment in the Delta of Arkansas because nobody else is going to do it. And that's one of the places marginalized the longest, is going to get the least attention, all those sorts of things. So that's another example of a thing that we're trying. And so far, nobody's called us on the guarantee. The deployment is working out. They're getting it out. It's better. It's more. It's in places that it wouldn't have been. So far, it's working out.
Good.
I love that,
awesome.
Cory. Clark, I was just going to jump into like another impact investment option, just to share a little bit about Truist Foundation is partnering with a new organization called Connect Humanity. And I think that maybe they have reached out to a couple of you who are on the call, but their model really, I think, hits at a couple of the different challenges that we've heard about to kind of get over the hump to then get to more of those dollars that are available. And kind of building off what Cory said, there's lots of different financing, investing opportunities beyond just direct grant making. So Connect Humanity, their model begins by identifying, folks in the community who are organizing. They might be grant makers, they might be other, nonprofit organizations, might be like Christopher was saying, through the electrical co-ops, et cetera. They identify those that are kind of already working on this issue. And then Connect Community brings that expertise to community as well as planning grants for the community to really develop like what are their needs and how do they envision this operating most effectively for their community. And so those planning grants might be the 10% that Jerry was talking about that's required by the locality in order to get the state funds. It might be really mapping out like the business plan for a local non-traditional operator rather than getting a commercial operator to come in. So those planning grants are really customized to the individual community. And after the planning grant, then Connect Humanity is building up an impact investment fund as well as a loan pool or loan fund where they'll be able to provide very low interest loans out to the communities that want to then implement the plans that they have in place. And in addition, you know, as we were saying, it's having the devices. It's also, though, knowing how to use the devices. So they're really engaged with community to make sure that families, individuals, businesses have what they need insofar as broadband and devices, but then also know how to use it. Because if you have a computer, but you just like don't know how to do everything on your phone, you're going to go back to your phone. Computer and use, and you know, getting over any of those hurdles that might get in the way to make sure that those who now have access to the connection are also taking advantage of it and actually using it. And I'll drop the link into the chat for the Connect Community website, but they're doing work. We're looking at a partnership for impacting specifically the 18 states, and Virginia's in our Truist states. So there will be kind of opportunities coming up here in the next 12 months if there's any communities that are kind of ready for that and just needing some planning green and some assistance in getting that done.
Great. So Patty or Katie, I noticed a couple of questions in the chat. You want to bring those forward, or anybody have any other questions?
Sorry. Yeah, I think we've traded, a couple people have been trading a couple back and forth about the impact investing. I might defer to Stephanie Randolph if she has anything more specifically that she wants to add. But then I see from Toby, I think this is a great question, that they commented that they've never received funding requests focused on the access and affordability. Be curious to see if other people have received funding requests for those areas. And then I guess maybe what she say that, Toby, did you have other specifics, just wanting to know what other people are hearing or anticipating? Does anybody have anything they can weigh in on that? Maybe even Cory and Meghan, y'all could let us know. Did you reach out, or did you start hearing from communities that they had the issues with the access and affordability?
You know, for us, it's like a lot of people. It became real during COVID. The guarantee pilot that I talked about, we actually started that. We actually started the work on that probably a year prior to COVID. When COVID happened, the work that I was doing to get some match guarantees, you know, I had worked for for 9 months trying to find another $1.5 million. COVID happened, and I got that other $1.5 million in like 2 weeks. The other thing that's happened with us in Arkansas, it's like Virginia, mostly rural, organizations like the Arkansas Black Mayors Association, again, as they bring themselves together and sort of coalesce around like what are some problems we can try to solve as groups, then they begin to look to us again specifically on broadband and a few other things. But I think, like other folks have seen, you know, COVID honestly really just accelerated people's understanding of just how important it was. The work that had been done in our state on expanding broadband access prior to that had really been around schools and education, and it was all tied to. I'm gonna mess it up, but whichever was a No Child Left Behind, whatever. It turned to the kids having to take the test on the computers, like that happened, and then all the educations were like, oh my God, well, we don't have enough broadband access in our system for the kids in the schools to be able to take whatever the test for ESEA, NWEA, something, to be able to take this test on computers. So that was the last time our state addressed it, and then even then it was, oh, let's make sure that every school, and this is in Chris's work, let's make sure that every school has just enough broadband to take this test, right? Well, yeah, now let a teacher try to teach virtually with that just enough broadband, right? Or try to bring in folks to educate kids with just enough, because that was that 10-1, with just enough broadband. So honestly, that was the last time our state had actually addressed it in a way that was sort of at scale, was for schools.
From our perspective, and I'll just jump in here as an example, when we first heard about it, or when we were first, I think our first request we got was actually from a library in Casteel County, a very rural county, who said, our students are now having to go virtual and we don't have broadband anywhere. We've got very poor cell service in a lot of places, and they requested a number of hotspots from us, as Jerry mentioned, they had done in Dinwiddie and Sussex. And that was really our first request on this issue. Now, as again, to build off what Cory said, we had done stuff in one-to-one broadband, our one-to-one laptops and others, but all of a sudden there was this gap that nobody had been thinking of until the pandemic really highlighted these disparities. So there's been some good stuff in the chat. Patty, I'll ask you to bring some of that forward, maybe.
Toby just
I
raised her
can't read
hand.
and talk at the same time. I'm sorry.
Toby, you want to ask your question?
I do, thank you, and I apologize for not being on camera. So I'm with the Morrison, Gwendolen, and K-Fritz Foundation, and we have been raising this issue pre-pandemic, which suddenly, in the before times, which suddenly feels like 100 years ago, but we have been trying to broaden the conversation for a couple of years, particularly during the pandemic when broadband really only focused on K through 12. I'm the mother of 2 public school students in the K through 12 space. I'm not taking anything away from that, but this is around healthcare and telehealth. This is around legal services, legal service providers that used to hold Know Your Rights sessions in church basements and in office spaces or be in the hallways of the courthouses. This is about arts groups that had to, help artists in the creative economy move online, figure out intellectual property laws, and decide how to monetize their work products. This is every single piece of our economy. This is every single piece of our funding areas, and we fund a lot. So I really can't implore you all enough, not just to keep doing the fabulous work that you're doing, but to make sure that the conversation goes beyond K through 12, because it really is everything. It's helping the first responders, because the 911 the reverse 911 access. There's no piece that this doesn't touch. And when we have tried to raise this to other funders in the DC metropolitan area, what we hear back is, yes, we're talking about hotspots and Chromebooks and K through 12. And I feel like that is really missing the point, and in so many ways missing a huge opportunity to bring other funders on board. As my long rambling question in the chat, I apologize. We keep thinking about the digital divide as the 4 separate pieces. The wires or fibers, affordability, hardware, and software. And all of our requests and all of the grants that we've made have been around, hardware and software. We don't get anything about wires or fibers or affordability. And we get about 900 or so funding requests throughout the year. It's not like we're small or, the word's not out there. We just don't hear about this. So any groups that you can point towards the K-Fritz Foundation, and I will talk to anyone. I want to know what's going on. Our funding is DC Metro, but and then that's sort of a hard and fast rule. But I'd love to just learn. I've talked to a few other funders from across the country about this. I've talked to a few folks at COG, and we are desperately looking for someplace to make a difference. Thank you.
Toby, it's Patty. I wanted to just mention in the network news issue that came out, I guess it was just yesterday, there's actually a connection in there to an organization called the Virginia Telehealth Network. And I don't, Mara Servades, I think that's how you pronounce her name, who used to work with a lot of us on the Virginia Consortium of Health Philanthropists. She is their new executive director. And there's an article in there about them really working toward trying to improve broadband and everything, because the doctors and medical professionals are seeing this as the only way they're going to be able to keep up with the needs in the medical community. So she may have some other ideas for you as well on the advocacy front.
So Toby, I thought that was great, and I want to circle back to Cory. Cory, I know you all have done a lot of work on policy. Has this pandemic that's highlighted the inequities and highlighted the real dearth of inequities in so many different sectors that really Toby highlighted, has that helped make the policy work easier in some ways? Has it helped make the case for folks that, you know, broadband really does make everything better?
Yeah, honestly, I would love to say it. So it makes it clearer, but it has not made the policy work any easier, specific to broadband. And you guys could read the news just like I do. Whenever Arkansas shows up on the national news, personal, political commentary, it's never for anything good relative to state policy. We are, and again, specific to broadband, the policy, it's just us talking, right? Like the policy fight is really amongst and between, Chris talked about it, big telco and big cable. Like that's the challenge, because again, the necessity of the public-private partnerships that's going to get you to that little town down in the valley, like the necessity of that is not, you won't make as much money as you might. I mean, I'm trying to be judicious with my words about, but that's what it is. It's those folks that, that say, well, no, and some states it's different, right? But gosh, what would it mean if a city, if a municipality, if a town could set up its own broadband network, right? And you say that, and you name big telco, big cable, whoa, hold on, we need to be the only ones doing that, right? When from a technological standpoint, from an infrastructure standpoint, like, no, you don't have to be the only ones that can do that. School districts, counties, there's all sorts of opportunities for other folks to be in the space where the costs would be lower, and it would be locally controlled. Like, so when you start saying all those sorts of things, that's when, again, the big telco folks, who, again, they've got the lobbying dollars and all the things that we all understand that make this really difficult. Making progress, but it's not easy. It's like one little step at a time.
Yeah. And I will just add in, Cory, because I'm like nodding my head to everything you said. We have a little bit of history, and I don't know all of the details, in Wilson, North Carolina, with building a co-op. So kind of locally private-public partnership. It was so successful in Wilson, North Carolina, that they changed the North Carolina state laws they basically grandfathered Wilson in, but will not allow that to happen again because it was so successful. And you're exactly right. It is not the state of North Carolina that made that decision on their own. It is all of the kind of commercial companies that are pushing for that. So it's definitely something we want to get together on and get ahead of, so that doesn't happen again.
No, that's important. And I tell you, Kate, DeWitt, and I have been involved in a conversation along the Virginia-North Carolina border, trying to see if there was this regional conversation across the border that we could have on this very issue. And after a number of conversations, what we realized was there really wasn't much of a conversation to be had because the politics in Virginia were so much different than the politics in North Carolina on this very issue, right? And so it does make it a challenge. And to really, I think the point that Cory and others are making, the policy issue is a state issue, and it looks like it should be driven from the feds on something that's critical, but it's not going to happen, I fear. So
Chattanooga, Tennessee is another example, Meghan, of exactly what you were talking about.
Exactly, DeWitt. And I learned through that example that at the state level, Tennessee has a minimum monthly kind of charge for broadband that's $25. So even in Chattanooga, where if they wanted to say, okay, affordability we need to have like a sliding scale and it needs to go down to as little as $2 a month, they have this state policy that it has to be 25. So they still, even with like all of the structure in place to support a more affordable, accessible broadband, then they have this law that has to be $25. It's just like you're banging your head against the wall. So yes, I think Chattanooga and Wilson are a really good example.
Absolutely. Patty or Katie, other questions that you want to highlight from the chat, or anything else? Anybody else just wants to bring up?
We've been having lots of conversations internally, basically about what some of the things that Toby just brought up, that this is really a universal issue that affects so many different issue areas that philanthropy cares about. And then I've gotten some questions from members at large just saying, why are we doing this broadband thing? And so making the case for investments in broadband, I think, is the challenge before us now as we think about engaging more funders across the state. And this, while it can be seen as more of a rural issue, I think we have lots of broadband access challenges in our more urban environments as well. Not necessarily with the fiber optics and cable, but with the technology to access and tap into broadband. And so I think that this is a really interesting topic as we think about what the network could do together, both as individual funders and as a network at large for the Commonwealth, because this is a major issue. It's also a major opportunity, right? With nearly $1 billion in state and federal funding coming into this issue to expand 100% universal broadband access to all Virginians just within the next 2 years. It's a really fast and accelerated pace. I'd love to see that happen, and talking about how we can make that happen, I think, is the bigger question. And how do we get more folks interested in this topic and make them see that this is a lens for which we could view some other work.
That's one of the reasons why we try. I use the equity language all the time and sort of talk to people about like what equity as a framework for action means. And if you use Virginia as an example, and this is the short version of it, if you can figure out how to get universal broadband access to the places that have zero access or have the least access and or need it the most, then it's easy for everybody else. Like if you figure out first the most difficult challenge, then it's just like gravy for the whole rest of the state. But you got to get people to want to believe that the folks in the towns that you've neglected for that they actually deserve it. Like you got to folks to believe that first, and then you got to get them to understand that, gosh, this works for everybody. Our friends in California talk about targeted universalism, the curb cut effect. Like we all use that little bitty divot on the curb to get across the sidewalk and make life easier for us as we traverse the streets of any major city. That was a specific thing for folks that are differently abled. But like when they figured that out, gosh, it's easier to move your groceries around. It's easy. So anyway, that's part of the reason why we try to frame this as an equity question, because this is one of those things that, gosh, if we would just invest in the toughest places first, then it gets so much easier everywhere else.
I also really appreciated Christopher's point about none of us would accept a 10-to-1 in our own households. And the fact that we've set the lowest common denominator for some of our rural communities is unacceptable and is a major equity issue, right? And so it's universal broadband access at affordable high speeds, right? I mean, I think that might be a conversation for down the road, but if we want to future-proof this, we have to be thinking about it now.
No, I think that's exactly right. And to get back to this earlier point that DeWitt and others made, one of the things that philanthropy can do is this convening. Well, as we're convening, the next thing is this shared learning, right? It's this bringing to light these disparities, these challenges, and then bringing Cory in to make the argument about why this is so important. I think is what my takeaway from part of this. So,
Cory, I hope that your calendar is free. I think you're going to be invited to speak to some boards over the next couple of months. You might need to just come on down to Virginia.
We'll talk to Sharice and we'll get you some time in Virginia. How about that, Cory?
I was going to say I liberally use people from other places to come say to come and say things that need to be said in real transparent terms, and then they can leave. So yeah, I'd be happy to help in that way.
Awesome. Other questions, other things, other things that people are interested in learning about? I think Katie just put a good question in there. What would we like to see as next steps? And part of that's a VFN question. What can VFN do to support this? But really, I think I'm going to kind of answer that question and to go back to DeWitt's point, as a place-based funder, we're still trying to feel our way through this. But I do think where we landed and Katie, I'll help you make this case as well as I can, that this is a really critical issue, and we need to convene. We need to keep having these conversations, and we need to do some shared learning on why this is so important. We're gonna also bring Toby in and get her to make her argument as well. So we've got some great advocates on this call now. It's like Community Development 101. Who else needs to be at this table? And let's get them here for the next time.
Clark, just piggybacking on what you said, we are going to have perfect timing either in late December or beginning of January, because Chandler Vaughn, who's with the DHCD, said that's when the state will have made their VATI decisions about who is moving forward. And again, that's still not a guarantee that even though the state selects X number of these projects, it's still not a guarantee that they will get to move forward, because the community still have to put up their matching and their partial funding for the different pieces. And so that's a place where, and that's, obviously they're going to be good about cross-cutting the state and everything. So it probably will impact all of our members in some way with the localities that they select. So we definitely will have a chance to convene some more on this. But yeah, we greatly appreciate any next steps and ideas that you all have.
Patty, I think that was a great point, that one of the things, it's a bit of a wait and see. 750 million in the state sounds like a lot of money. It ain't enough money. And so, we've kind of done this analysis, or at least we feel like we've done this analysis where we are now. We have a better idea of what excellence looks like. What we're struggling with is what are those gaps in between there. And those gaps will be better outlaid for us in Virginia, I think, after that announcement is made. And then we can, my argument would be, we pull funders back together and go, here's some of the gaps, folks. This is what we're seeing. And we can better figure out at that point how we can be useful in this conversation.
Not just that, but the state is working with Virginia Tech on a house by house broadband coverage map for the state. And that's supposed to be rolled out in early 2022. Right now in Virginia, we just have census tract levels. If one house has connection on us in a census tract, that whole census tract is officially covered by broadband. So we don't even really know how bad the problem is in terms of coverage right now. We're flying blind a little bit. And so that, to build on what Clark was saying, that's going to be another action point, I think, when we get back and we realize if this map does come out and it's as detailed as they hope, there are more gaps that we weren't even, than we were even aware of.
Good, Jerry. That's good information and very helpful. Well, awesome. Any kind of Patty is throwing another question in chat.
No, I was sorry, I was answering Toby's. Toby, I'm going to put your question back to the all of the speakers for both sessions and see if they have any thoughts on. And you know, Rob and Mockenhop just did our advocacy. I want to call it a toolkit, but it's not our advocacy map of the state. And she may be able to tell us some specific ones that people in their interviews mentioned about broadband.
Good. Meghan has just put up Georgia's map in the chat.
I love this because it shows exactly what Jerry was speaking to, the FTC numbers versus reality. And their study looked at, I think, if 80% of the census tract is covered versus one household. And it has this fun tool where you can scale like across the state back and forth to see the changes. And so if Virginia Tech I'm assuming they, might model something like this that just shows like the reality of the situation. It was a helpful tool for me to show my board that, the numbers lie sometimes. So to really like not stop the investment or stop the consideration because the need is very real and it's still there.
So Meghan, I want to build on that with a question that I don't know if it would be helpful or not, but it does. In the first session, and I've heard Evan Feynman talk about this. Evan is the governor's liaison on broadband services, as many of you know. The challenge process that they're able to use during the VATI application, and the argument is it will help if a big provider comes in and says, no, we're covering everybody on that street or everybody that actually that group or that neighborhood can say, no, you're not, prove it. And so they hope that will be helpful in this process. Is that an accurate description? And do we think it'll be as helpful as build? This is all quiet. We're not going to share this.
I know. It's hard to say. I think a picture and like the reality is definitely worth 1,000 words, right? So I mean, I think that it might help, but I don't know how much it'll sway some of that kind of decision making at the highest level.
Yep. Good.
Clark, Andy Johnston at PATH. I feel like some of these smaller providers will be trying to take advantage of that challenge issue as well to protect some of their smaller areas. But I haven't really heard anything about that locally. I don't know where those challenges are going.
Yep. Good. Thanks, Andy. Great. Any final thoughts for this group? I tell you, I thought this was a very rich conversation. A number of my takeaways are really to this broadband makes everything better. I think the argument that Toby said better than I on that really illustrated that is important. I think the arguments and the real clarity that Cory showed on the equity on this issue and how you can use that really as a lean in to show if we tackle these hardest problems first, it's going to help us all. It's going to make the easy ones are then easier is important. I think this notion that DeWitt shared about how do we convene and really do some shared learning on these critical issues is important. I think a question that was laid out on what's our capacity to do this is important. I think as a place-based funder, we're still learning, and I hope all of us in philanthropy are still learning where we can be useful on this issue. So to our panelists, Meghan, Cory, Jerry, DeWitt, thank you very much for spending your time with us today. I thought it was a rich conversation, and I couldn't be more appreciative.
Thank you all so much. And Clark, big thanks to you too. Really appreciate your help thinking through this session and moderating today's conversation. Patty, I know Patty and I really appreciate that, so that we didn't have to jump into this conversation that we don't know much about, other than we know that it's important, and we feel really strongly about making sure philanthropy is well educated and knows the opportunity. We are going to reconvene offline and talk a little bit about what next steps could be. So everyone, please stay tuned. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't invite everyone to please join us on November 17th. It is our business meeting and one-year anniversary celebration. We'll be sharing a little bit about how and why VFN was founded, what we've accomplished this year, and what we can look forward to in 2022. So please do join us for that, and we will see you all again real soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.